What's up, Rovers? It's the back half of patch 2.0 and Roccia is finally here. I hope you've all enjoyed exploring the wonders of Renacita because, well, it's definitely been my favorite update since launch. But with the Fool's Troupe taking center stage at the climax of the story, it's time for our favorite gremlin to step into the spotlight. Does Roccia unseat Sanhua's Camellya's premier support? What other teams can she fit into, and is there special tech you can use to skyrocket her potential? Well, that's what we're gonna look into today. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. This guide has taken over 50 hours as usual to make, so if you found this video helpful, do feel free to leave a like or subscribe. Full team breakdowns have been moved to a separate video follow-up. This guide will still mention her best teammates and how the teams play, but nuances on gearing and rotations will be saved for the next video. We will cover Roccia's team role and main mechanics first, then the typical deeper dive. Forte Priorities come after, and then Echo stuff, Mainstats, Substats, and how Moonlit set compares to the new Midnight Veil set. In fact, we'll even talk a bit about how that new set affects team building in general. Then we have weapon comparisons, endgame stat goals, and her sequences breakdown. The last bit includes her rotations, and then a short summary of her team setups. Let's dive right in. So Roccia's kit is actually pretty simple. She has two main niches she fills, damage buffing the team and sucking enemies in. For the first role, damage buffing, this comes from her liberation and outro. Therefore, she does not require super specific rotations to get her job done. So long as you cast her ult and are able to outro, 90% of why you bring her on the team is already there. Of course, rotating properly is very helpful to speed up team rotations. Her ult grants up to 200 flat attack for that, to the entire team, based off of her crit rate above 50%. It caps out at 70%, so just make sure to build for that. Her outro grants plus 25% basic and plus 20% Havoc damage amplify, so perfect for Camellya and still extremely good for several other characters. The second main niche is grouping, and being the largest grouper in the game even more than Jianshan's ult. This comes from two tools, being her skill and her magic box utility item. The skill drags everybody in aggressively for 1 second and lets you start bouncing around for AoE damage, whereas the magic box from her inherent skill is granted to the next swap in a unit when she performs her outro. Basically, you get a massive grouping tool that can be used once every 10 to 15 seconds, alternating between her skill or the magic box on a different unit. This is extremely useful for characters that lack a true AoE and rely on cleave hitboxes, such as Havoc, Rover, Danjin, Encore, and even Zhezhi to hit multiple enemies, and you'll see more of those teammate options later. Roccia's mechanics are very simple to set up. She really only performs one thing. You bring her in, you cast her ult, and skill to set up her bouncy bounce until she's ready to set up her Mamma Mia until she's ready to outro. Everything happens relatively quickly, and if you use quick swaps, it cuts down her field time down even further to match Sanhua. By default, Roccia is already faster than most sub DPS in rotations, but slower than Sanhua. Quickswap optimizations go a long way to close the gap in rotation length, while retaining all of her superior buffs and utility. In casual play and rotations, you normally want to intro Roccia because it grants one full segment of her Forte bar, as well as a decent bit of Concerto, but it also lets her skip straight to basic 4, which grants in an entire extra segment of her Forte bar again. Her S1 does not fully replace her intro as a result, and I kind of consider it a bait sequence, but more on that later. Quick swaps will allow you to fill the same two segments of the Forte bar without needing to intro, and opens up a lot more team rotation options. For a full overview of her rotations, refer to the section later onwards. It's time to look at Roccia's Forte Priorities. As a sub DPS support, her kit's buff mechanics take precedence over her own damage. This means her grouping tool she grants to her teammates, Magic Box, is the first thing you want to go for if you're having difficulties with mob content, or want quality of life since it is locked behind her inherent skills and is very common on Overworld. If all you want Roccia to do is damage buff and grouping, this is all the investment you need. If you want her to deal more damage, the main priority will be her Forte Circuit. This is where the damage of her Mamma Mia bounces come from. If you want to play her as a main DPS though, or chase higher sequences, her Forte Circuit tree becomes even more important. The Liberation tree is the next priority, making up slightly less damage and much less if you play her as a main DPS or have sequences. Her skill tree is slightly more important than her basic tree, but neither contribute much DPS, and you will sometimes even cancel her skill early for faster rotations. Intro damage is mostly irrelevant, so that tree can be skipped. Still lost on how her Forte Circuit works? No worries, let's dig a little deeper. Roccia's Forte bar uses imagination as its resource, with 3 segments holding 100 imagination each. This is gained from intro skill, basic attacks, or skill cast. Notably, her last normal attack, Basic 4, grants a full 100 imagination, and using her intro grants 100 as well, while instantly skipping her to Basic 4. Therefore, the fastest way to fill her Forte in a standard rotation is to intro, Basic 4, and then skill. Whenever Roccia has at least 100 imagination, casting skill or hitting an enemy with her heavy attack will put her in the beyond imagination state, which is represented by small pero icons appearing over her filled Forte segments. She remains in this state so long as she doesn't touch the ground. Even swapping off will still leave her in the air, slowly falling. So long as you swap back in time, she won't fall down. You can also dodge or perfect dodge in mid-air to both delay ground pounds from an interrupting hit and avoid aerial hits. Normal attacking during this state uses the Real Fantasy Enhanced Basic and bounces to the ground. This attack has a massive AoE and is actually very misleading. It hits on the ground even further out than the visual edge, and the hitbox is actually a tall cylinder and will damage enemies even higher up in the air. If she still has at least 100 imagination remaining, she will bounce back in the air and reactivate the beyond imagination state. This continues until she doesn't have enough imagination left. Her S6 will allow you to keep pogoing after you cast her ult and reach Real Fantasy 3, even if you have no imagination left for the next 12 seconds. Roccia's Liberation is just a simple big AoE hit, however it grants a flat attack buff to the entire team for 30 seconds. This scales off her crit rate stat in battle. For every 0.1% crit rate she has above 50, she grants the team 1 attack flat, capping out at 70% crit rate. Or in other words, build her for 70% crit rate so she always buffs the team with 200 attack flat. That's it. Because it's just cast ult to buff, it's very accessible and can be quick swapped in at any moment as needed. Normally I recommend front loading it in your rotations. Roccia's Resonance skill tree is very short to cast in battle. It only consists of the Havoc tornado you spawn in, while granting you 100 imagination and forcing you to enter the beyond imagination state. After about 1 second of cast, you have already moved into her Forte circuit enhanced basic bouncy attacks. Notably, the skill cast can be cancelled the moment that tornado appears to enter the beyond imagination state early, and speed up rotations if grouping isn't necessary. This occurs roughly half a second after cast and will save 1 second. Do not dodge cancel before it appears, as it will nullify the skill before it can grant the beyond imagination state, and Forte stacks. And finally, Roccia's basic attacks. In a normal rotation as a sub DPS, you barely use any of this, but in casual play, Basic 4 is used after intro to gain 2 Forte segments quickly. In Quickswap play, she starts from Basic 2 for manual swap-ins, allowing you to fit in 2 Basic 2-3, or a Basic 2-3-4 combo here and there. Holding heavy attack charges up to 2.1 Forte bar segments max before it forces you to release, and hitting an enemy with a heavy attack will grant another 1 full Forte segment and send you into the air to re-enter beyond imagination. It's the only other way to do so except casting her skill, which has a 10 seconds cooldown. The heavy attack is only used if you play Roccia as a main DPS before S6 as a way to re-enter beyond imagination, or to charge her Forte and enter the floaty state if her skill is on cooldown for some reason. Roccia's intro only deals damage, and the main use of it is to grant 100 imagination on cast, but this doesn't require any investment whatsoever, so you don't really need to level it much. Her outro is another big reason to bring her along, granting plus 25% basic damage and plus 20% havoc damage amplify. This makes her a really solid match with Camellya, but also a good option buffing Havoc Rover main DPS, and even Danjin and Encore, since the outro also activates Roccia's skill, Super Attractive Magic Box, granting the next Resonator the utility item to do the super big suck. Super useful for cleave hitbox DPS units that lack a true AoE. This also works for Zhezhi main DPS, but would obviously require a hyper-invested Zhezhi to be viable. Now, Roccia's inherent skills focus on increasing her damage and the Magic Box utility item. Note that the Magic Box is not part of her base kit and requires you to unlock it through this node. It provides the largest AoE suck in the game as an item to the next Resonator on outro. You have 14 seconds to use it or until you swap out, and honestly, you're probably gonna get the most out of this in your pincer game mode molding. It effectively deals 0 damage, so don't expect to do anything except group enemies. Also, note that it has 0 effect on rooted or large enemies, so it's mainly used for smaller mobs. You also don't have to use it in boss fights since it does nothing there and only provides visual clutter, but it does have a really funny cast sound though. Her other inherent skills is just a simple 20% attack buff for 12 seconds when she uses a skill or heavy attack, which are typically front-loaded in her rotation anyways. For minor nodes, Roccia gives 16% crit damage and 12% attack. Remember that her ult team buff scales off of crit rate, so you will still have to rely on your echoes for this as her nodes doesn't give any. Alright, let's look at her echo stats. The main comparison will be Moonlit Clouds versus Midnight Veil. Personally, I recommend sticking with Moonlit Clouds. Why? In a realistic normal hypercarry team, Midnight Veil is at best about as good as Moonlit Clouds. If you play frame perfect, it should actually be slightly better, but by an insignificant amount. The only way for Midnight Veil to be clearly better than Moonlit Clouds is if you play very well, and also Quickswap. And on top of that, these calcs are assuming something else. Moonlit Cloud scales all of its DPS value to the main carry you outro to. Midnight Veil instead splits up its DPS value between the equipping sub DPS and also the main DPS, which means that if your Roccia sub DPS isn't equally built to your main carry, you will get even lower numbers than I show here. TLDR, if you aren't quick swapping and also playing very well and also have a fully built Roccia, like a same build as a DPS, then you will not notice a benefit from using Midnight Veil over Moonlit Clouds on Roccia. In fact, if you play bad, Midnight Veil is actually worse than Moonlit. Also, if there's an investment gap by sequences, like an S3 Camellya versus S0 Roccia, then Moonlit will again pull ahead. In reality, Midnight Veil is much better suited to a dual DPS double Havoc team than a hypercarry setup. It has roughly the same personal DPS as old Havoc set, but also buffs on outro with no swap limitations. Think of it this way, Roccia deals about 50,000 more raw damage unbuffed per rotation with Midnight Veil versus Moonlit Clouds, but Heron's unique buff on Moonlit buffs the main DPS carry with a 12% final damage multiplier. Most main DPSs deal 500 to 650,000 raw damage unbuffed per rotation. Is Roccia's raw 50k damage and a 15 Havoc damage buff on outro equal to a 12% final multiplier on 600,000 main DPS damage? Barely. For the sake of accuracy, I've included calcs for both sets on all weapon variants in the spreadsheet if you're curious. If you're using Roccia main DPS with Mortefi buffer, I would actually recommend using Old Havoc set with Dreamless, or Nightmare Crownless. It has equal DPS to all of the other Havoc variants, you probably already have it farmed, and it's the easiest setup for her to use, and Midnight Veil's 5-piece effect isn't really useful on that kind of team. Now, the next section only applies to Midnight Veil, since on Moonlit you should be using normal Heron for 12% final damage multiplier and outro to your main DPS. Midnight Veil should also be using the Nightmare Heron for Roccia. You might notice that the unique Heron buff here shows 12% Havoc and skill damage bonus. That's not correct. If you click outline up top, you'll see it actually shows 12% Havoc and heavy damage. And if you check the character stat dropdown, you'll see 12% heavy damage and 0% skill damage. Just an FYI if you're running this. Also, Heron's Feather Spin will auto-parry anything within its range. Now, as neither Moonlit Clouds nor Midnight Veil give significant amounts of damage percent for Roccia, double Havoc 3 costs remain at least 5% ahead of Havoc attack in all scenarios, even if you have her signature. While not drastic, I would recommend sticking with double Havoc if possible. On all weapons, double attack and 44111 are roughly equal and always result in a 15 to 20% personal damage loss. On her signature, it's only a 13% loss. Using Midnight Veil grants a roughly 25 to 35% personal damage increase, which is about 50k raw damage, but as I said earlier, I do not recommend doing this on Roccia since it scales poorly if you have disproportionate investment to your main DPS, especially if you have big DPS sequences. For substats, well, she is 60 to 65% heavy damage on Moonlit Clouds and 55% heavy damage on Midnight Veil. This means that attack flat is still better than heavy percent on Roccia, since she is below the 70 to 75% threshold for them to be roughly equal. For energy, Roccia needs a baseline of 120 ER in all teams, with increasing amounts depending on teammates present and rotations used. Verina teams will add 5 ER to her requirements. Havoc Rover will also add 5. Skipping her intro will add 10 to 15 ER as well, which will be used in certain Quickswap teams. Therefore, in a Verina Havoc Rover team, Roccia will need 130 ER even if you intro her. Or, well, let's say if you skip her intro in a Shorekeeper Havoc Rover team, she'll want about 135 ER. Therefore, her substat priorities would be enough ER to ult, ranging from 120 all the way up to 140, then crit rate until 70% to ensure her ult gives the max 200 attack flat buff to the team, then typical crit damage, attack percent, attack flat, and finally heavy percent. For weapons, Roccia has quite a lot of options. This is because she is not reliant on a concerto weapon to do her rotations. She's inherently slower than Sanhua in non-Quickswap, but still faster than most other sub-DPS. Her concerto gen is also backloaded, meaning Mercado rarely ever makes a difference in rotation times. Now, I'll be getting to a rough Quickswap rotation later onwards on how it affects her moveset, but to start, her signature Tragic Comedy is a decent DPS boost for her, providing 24% more personal damage on Moonlit Clouds and 16% on Midnight Veil. Discrepancy is due to Midnight Veil's 2-piece plus 10% Havoc bonus, and Nightmare Heron's on-equip plus 12% Havoc and Heavy bonus diluting her signature weapon. Now, I do not think her weapon is worth it at all from a meta perspective, as heavy damage is an extremely rare main damage type for any DPS in the game. We have Jian and high sequence Jianxin, and that's it. Even Danjin is only about 25% heavy damage. There really is barely anybody in the game released that uses this kind of stat, so the future isn't looking bright in general. Now, if you like it for its aesthetics and you must have it for your Roccia, then by all means. Coming in second place though is Verity's Handle, charting an 8% improvement for Moonlit and 4% for Midnight Veil. Yao's signature weapon is good by virtue of being a crit stick weapon. Note that the Liberation passive is entirely useless on Roccia, as she deals 0 Liberation damage whatsoever. Behind these two is Abyss Surges, the 5-star standard. Still a really good choice for Roccia, and the extra ER really helps in team building, especially if you're playing Quickswap non-intro rotations that need higher ER, and in optimized situations will translate into 1 less ER substat needed and +1 attack percent substat. Not much to say here, it's just a big attack steroid with near useless DPS passive for Roccia. After the 5-star weapons comes our new Renacida craftable Legend of Drunken Hero. This weapon requires enemies affected by debuffs to acquire passive stacks. At max stacks, this is Roccia's best 4-star weapon, but at 0 stacks, it's her worst 4-star weapon, besides Mercado. Because none of the current Havoc roster, nor Zhezhi or Encore deal debuffs, this weapon at release is not worth it on her because it will never benefit from stacks. If down the road we get a new basic scaling or a Havoc main DPS that applies debuffs, then this weapon will become her best budget option. The next two weapons are effectively equal. Hollow Mirage and Celestial Spiral. Note that a max refined Celestial Spiral will reduce the amount of ER rolls she needs by 1 on Midnight Veil or Quickswap setups where you want higher ER. On default rotations, the passive makes no difference for Moonlit Clouds. Finally, near the very bottom is Stonard, the Battle Pass weapon. Despite being a crit stick and Battle Pass weapons known for being stronger, it has a useless passive today. And this completely defeats the point of using a Battle Pass weapon since their strongest point is typically the abnormally high scaling on the passive, reaching triple value in max refine. I would not recommend using 3-star weapons on her, but Gauntlet of Night is better than Originite. Also, Mercado is a pretty big damage loss, and as I said, the Concerto bonus is not needed for her rotations. You can use it to tidy up her ER on an early build when you're still working on her though. Now, if you manage to achieve all that we've discussed so far, then her endgame stat goals should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Forte, so it can take some time to reach this. Roccia's sequences are split evenly between utility in the first half and main DPS in the second half. For low spenders, this makes it easier to get an all-purpose team buffer than having to worry about her personal damage. All math was done assuming R1 Tragic Comedy with Midnight Veil. Why have I chosen Midnight Veil? Because if you're pulling her sequences, I assume she's fully built and min-maxed for optimal damage. This means if you're running Moonlit Clouds, her sequences are worth ever so slightly more damage, but her total damage output will still be lower. Note that all values are quoted in vacuum and will be slightly diluted in a full team comp rotation. Her main stopping points are S2, S4, and S6. S1 is what I call a bait sequence. Casting her skill grants an extra 100 Imagination Forte and 10 Concerto energy. You also get hyper armor while in your Mamma Mia. Note that her intro is effectively worth 200 imagination and 20 concerto because it instantly skips to her basic 4, which usually animation cancelled on hit and takes less than half a second to do so. Therefore, her S1 does not fully replace her intro. On Quickswap, you always at least basic 2-3 on Roccia, which is worth 13.43 concerto and is more than what her S1 gives. However, S1 plus Marcado can replace her intro or a backswap in a Quickswap rotation. But if you're getting her S1, why are you using Marcado? The main use of the imagination and concerto bonus is easier overworld rotations, otherwise the main draw of her S1 is the hyper armor of her bounces so you no longer get your rotation ruined. Remember, you can get back into Mamma Mia mode with a heavy charge, but this will waste time. You can also just dodge to avoid aerial hits or delay ground pounds from enemy ground attacks. In practice, her S1 is really only worth a measly 3.4% higher damage than S0. Her S2 is actually really nice for Havoc teams because it grants up to an easily maxable plus 40% Havoc damage bonus for 30 seconds. One stack of 10% per bounce and an extra 10% at 3 stacks. Solid 17% damage increase for Roccia over S1 and 1.21 times as strong as S0. Additionally, this is worth about a 12 to 14% total damage increase on a Havoc main DPS, like Camellya, Havoc Rover, or Danjin. S3 is a very simple but effective plus 10% crit rate and plus 30% crit damage buff on intro for 15 seconds. Helps to reach her 70% crit rate easier for max bus armor liberation and more personal damage. S3 is 18% stronger than S2 and 1.43 times as strong as S0. S4 starts leaning towards Roccia's main DPS. It grants her a bounce a 60% motion value multiplier. In a standard rotation, she bounces up to 3 times, but 6 times instead as a main DPS. Note that the improvement shown for her S4 assumes sub-DPS rotation. It is worth noticeably more if you play Roccia as a main DPS since the 6 bounces will make up a bigger part of her total damage output. As a sub-DPS, this is a 21% improvement over S3 and 1.73 times as strong as S0. Roccia's S5 honestly sucks, but this is par for the course for recent units. It just grants her ult a 20% motion value multiplier, which at this point is far weaker than her bounce spam. It also grants an 80% motion value multiplier to her heavy attack, which is very weak to begin with and only used in main DPS rotations to set up the second set of 3 bounces. You also stop using her heavy attack with S6, so this sequence is effectively useless and just a stepping stone. 4.4% damage increase over S5 and 1.81 times as strong as S0. Now her last sequence is very simple. S6 allows her to spam bounces for 12 seconds after she casts her ult. Note that you have to have a full Forte bar for it to work. After the third normal bounce, you gain access to extra bounces with same scaling as the third bounce at no Forte cost, and doesn't check to see if you have any Forte left. You also gain hyper armor for all of the new bounces as well. You also now get a 60% damage ignore on every bounce, basically big AoE damage. On a hyper carry team, every bounce will deal nearly 200k damage, letting you blow everything up easily with hyper armor. She can get up to 11 bounces out per ult, totaling over 2 million damage. Or in other words, S6 Roccia is about as strong as an S2.5 Carlotta, except all her damage is in a massive spherical AoE, and she can also group enemies together, and she has hyper armor. If you have her S6, I'm assuming you're using her as a main DPS and doing all 11 bounces. This is reflected in the table for the DPS comparison. S6 is a 17% improvement over S5 and 2.11 times as strong as S0, though do keep in mind that the total damage output is several times higher. Want to talk about Roccia's rotations? She's pretty simple. At a base level, you intro her, fill up her Forte bar, and bounce away before you outro. You can either cast her Echo outside of her rotation, or at the end, as all of her Echo options can only be casted on the ground or completely interrupt her moveset, like Dreamless. Otherwise, you're free to quickswap her moves inside of other Resonator movesets to build her Forte bar without needing intro, or quickswapping other characters between our Tornado skill casts and each bounce. Let's look at her standard rotation first. The basic Roccia rotation takes 5.72 seconds to perform with no difficult cancels or swaps. You bring her in with intro, basic 4, and immediately ults. Why do I ult at the top instead of the bottom of the rotation? Because I prefer to have the 200 attack flat buff for Roccia's bounces even on the first rotation, which is their main source of damage. The buff also lasts 30 seconds, and all of Roccia's teams rotate faster than that. After this, you can skill, and if the grouping isn't needed, you can dodge cancel to immediately go into Beyond Imagination state, instead of needing to wait out the entire tornado animation. This saves about 1 full second at max. Bounce 3 times and outro onto your next unit. That's it. It's pretty fast, right? Now for a rough overview of Quickswaps, her intro can be replaced by 2 basic 2-3 combos. Recall that she starts from basic 2 on swap in, which itself is pretty fast, and you can input buff her basics 3. Thus, this is how she competes with Sanhua comps to match similar rotation speed. She can also backswap her skill cast for grouping and bounces with other character movesets. Skipping her intro with Quickswaps cuts her 5.72 seconds of dedicated field time down to 2.23 seconds. Backswapping her bounces further cuts her dedicated field time down to just only 1 to 2 seconds, depending on the second character movesets used. Here's what a Quickswap rotation might look like at a full speed team with Havoc Rover. And finally, here's another team comp yet using another Quickswap rotation for Encore. As a reminder, the in-depth version of Roccia's team building will be in a separate video, since it takes an enormous amount of time to get team data and rotations done. If you want an early peek, I already refined all team rotations in the Roccia spreadsheet. Roccia prefers Shorekeeper over Verina because she does not benefit much from double intro herself, and actually doesn't even need her own intro at all in a Quickswap. This means you're free to double intro your main DPS regardless of healer used, which obviously gives an advantage to Shorekeeper's stronger buffs. Despite Roccia ult having only a 20 seconds cooldown, the advantage of not needing her intro is enough to tip into Shorekeeper's favor versus Verina's slightly faster team rotations. Team building for Roccia is pretty simple. She is a Havoc and basic attack amplifier with a grouping tool for cleave attacks that lack AoE. Therefore, pair her with those kind of attackers. This includes Camellya, Havoc Rover, Danjin, Encore, and Roccia. You can even use her as main DPS if you really want to, as Roccia has quite good damage if you focus on her bounces. Obviously, this will have lower damage than a main DPS, but her AoE coverage is stellar and pretty good for most tower content. For Camellya teams, you can play traditional hypercarry like Sanhua or Quickswap. The difference is that Sanhua doesn't gain much from Quickswap, and is primarily used to double intro Camellya. For traditional hypercarry, Roccia's longer field time prevents her from noticeably pulling ahead of Sanhua. However, if you use all the Quickswaps and backswaps available, Roccia ends up being a solid improvement over Sanhua for Camellya. Note that this is not mobile friendly and requires a fair amount of effort. It is not casual friendly either if you want the most out of Roccia to make her worth pulling for Camellya. Note that Sanhua still wants her intro or needs to give up a DPS weapon for Overture, whereas Roccia doesn't care and can always run a DPS weapon, giving an advantage to Shorekeeper teams, since you'll still be able to double intro Camellya there, whereas Sanhua struggles to do so. For Havoc Rover teams, your goal is to again minimize Roccia's field time. This ensures Havoc Rover can dump their entire Forte bar state into the enemy, while keeping rotations in line with Shorekeeper's 25 seconds ult cooldown. The main advantage over Sanhua Rover teams is again Roccia not needing her intro, and it also buffing Rover's ult, which is not considered basic damage. This allows you to play a Quickswap team that double intros Rover even on Shorekeeper. Alternatively, there's an easier rotation that doesn't double intro Rover, but note that it results in slower rotations and lower damage. As a result, Roccia improves Shorekeeper Rover rotations more than Verina Rover rotations, since Verina doesn't need her intro and could give it to Sanhua, whereas Shorekeeper can't do this. For Encore teams, note that damage output will always be lower than Sanhua teams for a single target. This is because Sanhua grants a 38% basic damage buff, whereas Roccia only grants 25%. Roccia's higher personal damage is not enough to close this gap. The main reason to run Roccia with Encore is for grouping to deal cleave damage against all mobs for faster clearing, or because, well, you like playing the gremlin team. This one is a Powerpuff Girls team that actually works and has proper synergy, unlike the Yoo-Hoo variant. Quick swapping is going to be pretty important for keeping team rotations down to align with ult cooldowns better. The Shorekeeper team is better than Verina because this team is still a decent bit slower than the Sanhua variant. Note that damage is still easily more than enough to clear middle tower without String Master on Encore, even if it has 10% fusion resist currently despite being technically weaker than the Sanhua variants. Danjin teams get a bit complicated. Your main goal is to make sure she only uses her full Forte Big Heavy when all buffs are active. First rotation, you'll probably pre-stack her Forte and then finish setting up your healer and Roccia in terms of fitting in 2 times full Forte Heavies in the 14 seconds outro buff window. Every full team rotation afterwards will only fit 1 Forte Heavy, but that's pretty much it. Zhezhi's main DPS is another option, but requires high investment in her and can be very awkward to play without practice. Jump cancelling her teleports with her enhanced skill would be very important in this team, since she uses her triple teleport twice per rotation as her main source of damage, and she's also the main DPS. It can save over 2 seconds per full team rotation, which is over 10 seconds per TOA fight. Note that at 60 FPS, the jump cancel can send you into the air, and you can dodge cancel this immediately to teleport to the next Heron. While Roccia's Havoc outro does not apply to Zhezhi, the basic percent still buffs almost everything on her, and the Magic Box utility is great for grouping mobs together, since nearly every single move on Zhezhi's kit has a cleave hitbox, but she has no AoE whatsoever. And finally, Roccia's main DPS. This works, and is probably one of the most fun and hilarious sub-DPS main DPS I've ever tried. You play your normal rotation, and then reset with a heavy attack to get back in the air and bounce 3 more times. It works with both Verina and Shorekeeper. I was able to pass 50k damage per bounce even without her signature at 0 and easily clear right and left tower with her. Do note that can get very Quickswap heavy to try and squeeze Mortefi's buffs in properly. Middle tower damage was a bit lacking and was clearing about 20 to 30 seconds past the 3-star mark. With signature, it might be possible to do it at S0, and at S6, all you gotta do is just skip the recharge to get back in there and bounce. You'll just only spam bounces until you need to outro. And there we go, the strongest Roccia teams we have available. For more breakdowns on how to play Roccia's teams, do stay tuned for the next upload. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I hope this Roccia guide has been useful for deciding on whether to pull on her banner. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values and test stuff. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or, better yet, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. Don't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.